There is now a push for what they're calling de-dollarization, the moving away from the US dollar as the world reserve currency. And this is actually more significant than most people are noting. Now, some people are saying, well, you can't really overturn the dollar. The dollar is always going to be there. It's still very strong, so on and so on. That's true. That is true. The dollar is very likely not going to go away. This isn't like the dollar is going to just poof into thin air and just disappear, and that's the end of it. What's happening, and what's already happened enough to impact it, is that the dollar is going to become one of many currencies on the world stage, and it's going to lose basically its monopoly on global transactions. Once that monopoly is lost, that means that America's main ability to hold other countries accountable. For example, if Iran tries to develop nuclear weapons, we sanction them. If North Korea develops nuclear weapons or launches nuclear tests, we sanction them. China right now, the CCP, is harvesting organs from living Falun Gong practitioners and people who practice other religions, and Congress right now is working on sanctioning them. Anytime there's an abuse of human rights, Russia invades Ukraine, we sanction them. And this is the way the United States has maintained essentially an element of global peace, what we call Pax Americana, the peace under America. Now, that includes some things I don't like, which is, for example, sending huge amounts of money to every country on earth, just about. Part of that is just the way that world reserve currencies work. America is not the first country in the history of the world to had to basically run the world reserve currency. You often need to provide money to certain countries to give them incentive to use the currency that you are, basically controlling. This has huge advantages, mainly just in the enforcement of standards. And essentially, for the United States, that's been what we've gotten out of it. I don't think we've actually benefited much as a people, but I would say the world has benefited quite a bit from the American idea that has been supported through the U.S. dollar being the world reserve currency. That is about to come to an end. And I would argue maybe is already past the threshold where it would have meant anything. At this point now, if China invades Taiwan, if Russia invades Poland, if North Korea launches nuclear tests or even decides to attack South Korea, there's nothing we can do, at least not using currency, that will have any consequence other than going to war with them. That buffer between that buffer of hostilities between diplomacy and war, right? Financial pressure was the buffer. That buffer is now gone. It is now diplomacy or war if we're going to enforce any kind of global standards. That's why this matters so much. You could argue the CCP was already undermining this to an extent. Countries that were sanctioned by the United States could still trade with China. And the CCP, through that mechanism, was running what it called the Pax Sinica, the peace under China. And in their eyes, the Pax Sinica is the replacement to the Pax Americana, the peace under America. The Pax Sinica represents something very different. What the CCP promotes is the idea that countries can do whatever the heck they want to their citizens. You want to kill them, you want to starve them, you want to invade another country, hey, so be it. That's the CCP's way of doing things. What is considered unethical under the Pax Sinica is if another nation tries to criticize other nations for their actions. In other words, there's no longer a standard. The only standard is do not criticize me for what I'm doing. That's what the alternative to the U.S.-led system is. The future that represents is one of war. The future that represents is one of absolute tyranny, without any kind of consequence or mechanisms for holding them accountable. The future that represents is one where there's no longer any kind of standard of enforcement for basic rights and liberties. The idea that America represented to the world will come to an end, if that is the way things move towards. And that is why the Pax Sinica, or what they call the China model, or the China dream, as they also call it, is such a danger to the world. The CCP is exporting this through many mechanisms. One of them would be the centralized banking digital currencies. Another one would actually be the way they manufactured the COVID-19 response, including, for example, the lockdowns, the mask mandates, the vaccine passports, systems of social control using a new type of high-tech tyranny that the CCP has also been promoting, such as monitoring technologies, surveillance, digital IDs, and so on, which are used to then monitor citizens and ensure that they are complying with state policy. The CCP, even through the One Belt, One Road initiative, where it's going to Africa and Latin America and even Australia and other countries, and building critical infrastructure, they are also constructing a lot of the core technologies for the implementation of what they call the social credit system, which includes cameras, things that monitor biometrics, eye movements, all kinds of things, which can be used to track, manage, and give ratings to different citizens within that country. The CCP is spreading its model of governance, and that is the main contender to the U.S. model. Now, folks, you know that I'm a critic of, a lot of the bad policies right here in America. I don't. In my opinion, some people are like, well, why do you criticize China when there were problems in America? Look, there can be more than one thing wrong in the world at a time. Hate to break it to you. There can be more than one thing wrong in the world at a time. Just because China does something wrong doesn't mean everything America does is right. And it doesn't mean that we shouldn't criticize bad things as they come. It's not like an absolute black and white. You like one country, therefore you have to approve of every single thing they do. It's not like that. But I will tell you, as much as we criticize what's happening in the United States, it is nothing compared to what you have in some countries. They are much, much further along. The tyranny that exists is much, much more entrenched. And what the China model represents is a nightmare future. It is the worst thing that could happen to the world if that becomes the way things are. I will say with some happiness that both sides of our political spectrum, whether you're Republican or Democrat, for the most part, they have stood up against the CCP, even though you do have a lot of corruption. And they have taken some very good moves to criticize the CCP for things like human rights abuses, the latest one being their criticism of organ harvesting, which was notably passed by, I think, all but 2 members of the House of Representatives just recently. And so that being said, the de-dollarization movement is very consequential. This is not something we should just ignore. As much as as much as I criticize the Federal Reserve and printing, Federal Reserve banknotes, and as much as I dislike some of the financial institutions right here in the United States, I would take them any day of the week over what the CCP is pushing. Any day of the week, folks. And this is something we should all be paying attention to. Let me show you what's happening right now. We'll start at the top. This is first off here on Twitter. It says, why are countries ditching the US dollar as an intermediary? China and Brazil reached a deal to trade in their own currencies. China and France completed their first yuan-settled LNG trade, yuan being the Chinese currency, signaling an end of using the US dollar for these energy trades. Benzinga, another article here, says, hold on to your wallets. A new world currency could be in the making, courtesy of BRICS nations. Similar to the euro, right? Essentially a union of nations currency through the BRICS nations. It says here, the BRICS alliance is exporting the creation of an innovative currency with plans to share proposals on its establishment at the forthcoming summit in South Africa, according to Alexander Babakov, deputy chairman of Russia's parliament, the State Duma. Speaking at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum event in New Delhi, India on Thursday, Babikov said the plan is to initially transition to using domestic currencies in transactions and then introduce and circulate a digital or alternative form of a groundbreaking currency in the near future, like a CBDC, for example, centralized bank digital currency. Babikov anticipates that the BRICS Leaders Summit will reveal a preparedness to implement this particular initiative, with work on the project ongoing, news agency Sputnik, Russian media, reported. Let me show you something else. Macron in France, getting on the side of the CCP and turning against the United States. Says Macron says Europe should reduce dependence on U.S. dollar after meeting with China's Xi, as in Xi Jinping. Says French President Emmanuel Macron has suggested that Europe should reduce its dependency on the United States, amid reports that some countries have begun, quote, de-dollarizing. He said, this is during his meeting, he told this to Politico, there is a great risk Europe gets caught up in the crises that are not ours, which prevents it from building its strategic autonomy. It says Xi and the Chinese Communist Party have backed Macron's, quote, strategic and autonomy concept, as CCP officials often refer to it when meeting with other European officials. And he said, quote, the paradox would be that, overcome with panic, we believe we are just America's followers. That's Macron saying this in the interview. And he said, is it in our interest to accelerate a crisis on Taiwan? For example, how do you accelerate a crisis on Taiwan? You mean if the CCP invades Taiwan and then you defend a country defending itself against the CCP? That's what he's saying. And then he says, quote, the worst thing would be to think that we Europeans must be followers on this topic and take our cue from the U.S. agenda and a Chinese overreaction, i.e. a war between China and the United States. After meeting with Xi Jinping, notably. It says Macron also suggested, with the strong support of Beijing and Moscow, Russia and China, that European nations should reduce their dependence on a, quote, extraterritoriality of the U.S. dollar, i.e. the U.S. dollar being in other countries, being used in other countries. And he said, if the tensions between the two superpowers heat up, we won't have the time nor the resources to finance our strategic autonomy, and we will become vassals. In other words, they're saying that if China and America go to war with each other, they don't want Europe helping America. They want to be out of it. It'll be an America versus China war, and maybe Russia as well. And they want to pull their currency out and not be in any way involved. They will not help us. That's what he's suggesting. Another story here, Epoch Times. No reason for Malaysia to rely on U.S. dollar, Prime Minister says. So Malaysia here. Says Malaysia no longer believes it's necessary to depend on the U.S. dollar, Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim said during an address to the nation's parliament. Following last week's state visit to China, and you're seeing a pattern here, folks, people meet with China, then they suddenly come out and say, why do we need the U.S. dollar? Let's abandon the U.S. dollar. Hey, look at my random idea that has nothing to do with my meeting with Xi Jinping. That's right, this is what they keep saying. They meet with China, they meet with Russia, and then suddenly they're like, hey, I have a great idea. Why don't we ditch the U.S. dollar in case there's a war with China and the United States? Hey, what a random idea. I wonder who came up with it, right? Different countries keep stating this, essentially.